Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our virtual Wind Symphony rehearsal. If you are all dressed, please turn on your video. We like to see smiling faces. It looks like those of you who have your video on have dressed. Thank you very much. And if you haven't, we can contact Katie Wargowski, who is obviously working in the costume shop at her local school there, preparing for something. I want to welcome all of you to what I think will be a fantastic presentation today on the life and times of Percy Grainger. As we go throughout the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to type those in the chat when we get towards the end. In the end, well, we don't know exactly when that may be. I know that we have a lot of content that Mr. Keene would like to cover, and we'll cover as much of that as we possibly can. We will have a Q&A session at the end if you wish to ask Mr. Keene a question. I'm very pleased to welcome today to our virtual Wind Symphony our third and final guest Zoomer of the fall semester, Professor Emeritus James Keene of the University of Illinois. Mr. Keene retired from the university in 2008 as the Brownfield Professor of Music and the Director of Bands. He taught at the University of Illinois beginning in 1985, and prior to his arrival served in similar capacities at the University of Arizona and what was then East Texas State University, now Texas A&M University Commerce. Those of you who are in the Greyhound Sound at the current time know that we play Commerce, and as I see Dr. Beatty here, the saxophone professor at Commerce, for many, many years, we handled Commerce very handily. And then something very fishy started to happen with the recruiting approach at Commerce, and well, they've taken care of us for the past several years. Mr. Keene is a graduate of the University of Michigan. He received both his bachelor's and master's degrees there as a student of both the legendary band conductor William D. Ravelli and one of our most important conducting teachers and music educators in general, Elizabeth Green, who my conducting students will remember was the author of a very important textbook entitled The Modern Conductor. I believe that Mr. Keene, I know he is a native of the state of Michigan and has now relocated to San Antonio, where he lives with his wife, who, when I was a student at the University of Illinois, was our professor of harp. And I always thought it was so cool that all of our ensembles at Illinois were assigned their own harpist. Can you imagine that? Having a harp studio so large that you had a harpist assigned to each ensemble. Pretty incredible. So with that, Mr. Keene, I want to welcome you to our session, and I think that I asked you to unmute. If you'll click that button, you can unmute. It's very nice to see you today, sir. How are you doing?
Well, am I dressed properly here? You
Yeah,
asked.
look at that. Look at that. I mean, you talk about product placement. That's incredible.
Well, I tell you, I almost didn't make it because I wore this one time and got mugged, so I wasn't sure I would make it.
Really?
Anyway, hello. Well, in any case, thanks for that kind introduction. This is really weird. This is the second one of these that I've done, and I've got two more that I'm doing coming up, and it's even more weird. What Mr. Seifert referred to, or was in terms of talking about my wife. We've been down here now 13 years, and this is our 13th year in Texas, in South Texas. We live in the hill country, about 24 miles north of San Antonio there. She had a studio. She just retired from studio teaching in the spring, and she had a studio of 24 students, which she's passed on to a former student of hers. But the last the last 6 weeks or so of her teaching, she had to do it all online. And she absolutely hated it. And at first found it difficult. And then finally she got it into a bit of a rhythm. So this is certainly not an easy thing to do. You know, if we talk about when we discuss doing this in terms of, well, what should we do for a topic? You know, Mr. Seifert, Professor Seifert said, well, what about talking about Percy Grainger and his music? Because we had done a good deal of his music at Illinois, recorded a major portion of his repertoire through the years. And I had the good fortune of doing what some people think may be the very first full performance of Lincolnshire Posy, and conducting that in Australia. So I was able to do the music of Grainger. I've actually done it on 4 different continents. So I love it. I love Grainger's music. And I know that I know that Professor Seifert looks forward to doing some Grainger, and has done some of the works of Grainger in the past. So we'll talk about that. Grainger kind of, you know, talking about Grainger and the way he approached bands and the way he became attracted to bands is in many ways kind of a metaphor for the development of bands and the way bands have come to be. He was a child prodigy. He was born. We call him Percy Aldridge Grainger. That's actually not his given name. He was born George Percy Grainger. His mother was Rose, or Rosa Aldridge, became known as Rose, and he didn't want to be called George. He wanted his own identity. His grandfather on his mother's side was George Aldridge, so he wanted his own identity. So he just basically chose to discard the name George, was known anyway as Percy, and took the name Percy Aldridge Grainger. When he was really, as I say, a child prodigy, and when he was 10 years old, actually, just before that, a very, very famous German musician, a German pianist, theoretician, composer, arranger by the name of Pabst came to Australia. And it was about that time that Grainger's mother, who was his piano teacher, felt like Percy by this time had sort of outgrown her and needed to branch out. And so anyway, he began studying with Louis Pabst, and Pabst was just amazed with the way he took off, and just encouraged, whether it was Grainger's idea or Pabst's idea. A year later, in 1911, Pabst started teaching him harmony, music theory, what amounted to arranging, besides just learning to play and learning what basic music theory is from a performer, a young person's standpoint. He began studying and doing that. Somewhere a few years following that, in 1895, when Grainger was 13, he and his mother left for Europe. Pabst was from Frankfurt and had told them and told the Graingers so much about the European musicians, people that he could study with, people he could learn with, people he could branch out to, but also performance opportunities. So he did that, and he began studying, but he also began concertizing, doing concert tours. And that's when Grainger fell in love with 2 things musical. He fell in love with the orchestra, which he hadn't spent much time with. He had gone to some concerts, but now he got the chance to become a soloist with symphony orchestras. And that also brought him in touch with some other composers, such as Frederick Delius, Edvard Grieg, and composers where he played their music, the Grieg Piano Concerto, for instance, and became famous for his performances of the Grieg. He got to know those composers, and also in terms of making some friendships with those composers, became very, very interested in some of the music that they were specializing in, which was some of the folk music. And in this case, it was the Scandinavian folk music, or the Nordic folk music. And he became very, very interested in Nordic folk music, in British folk music, English folk music, folk tunes. And he really started branching out at this time. A pretty interesting character, because now he became very, very much interested. He was only just in his early 20s, and he was already interested in collecting the folk music. And somebody came up with the invention of wax cylinders for recording, the precursor of the tape recorder, so to speak. And what we know, so he began, the best way he knew to collect them, because he couldn't jot them down as quickly as one would imagine, the best way he didn't want to miss a thing, is he began collecting on those wax cylinders, those folk tunes. Let's go ahead and put a few of those things, a few of those recordings from the wax cylinders. Let's go, Mr. Seifert, to some of my clinic excerpts here, and let's listen to. Let's listen to George Ray. Let's listen to number 17, which is George Ray singing Lord Melbourne. We got number 7. There we go. Okay, now we're going to kind of deviate. We're going to come back and hear a couple more folk singers, but we're going to kind of deviate from that, because I want to sort of back up. Now we've gone from Grainger as a young man, or actually Grainger as a boy, to Grainger in his early adult years, where his personal, how should I say, his personal development kind of went from being a child prodigy pianist to soloing with orchestras, to becoming interested in music theory and composition, to be interested in basic folk music and the folk tunes that so many of our classical composers were using in their more sophisticated pieces. But now let's back up again, because he would take that music, of course, and put it into some really, really basic things. Let's go ahead and take track number 8, and take the opening of Irish Tune from County Derry. Many of you, I think, have probably played this already, and some of you at least would know the tune. Everybody would at least know the tune. You might not think of it as Irish Tune from County Derry or Londonderry Air, but you might think of it as Danny Boy. But let's put a little bit of number 8 on, and we're going to come back to number 8 for a different reason soon. Go ahead. You might want to put up the volume a little bit. Okay, that's enough of that. All right, everybody knows what I'm talking about. We'll come back to that, because we're going to talk about that from kind of a different reason pretty soon. You want to turn up the volume a little bit? I don't know how their volume is, but I could probably stand a little bit more volume. I don't know if you can control that with the excerpts or not, Mr. Seifert, or if they need to control that themselves.
I will try to control it.
Okay.
But they can too.
Okay. In any case, it was also around that time, that period of time from, let's say, 1906 to 1910, that Grainger, by this time he was not he was not totally happy with his experience. It was almost militaristic with his experience in Germany and things. And he and his mother had gone and done some of their concertizing in Scandinavia and Northern Europe, but they were also taken by London and the scene in London and the scene in the British Isles in particular. So by this time he was interested in that. And obviously then, by this time, he was going to be very, very interested and taken by the music of Gustav Holst and Ralph Vaughan Williams. And so became much aware of those music and noticed that they were using folk music in many of their orchestral works, but also they had written works for this strange thing called the military band. Okay, now we're going to talk about this and how that came to be, but let's get something straight about that term military band. You guys have probably this is strange saying you guys, and there's nobody there on the other end except Mr. Seifert, sitting at his desk here. Anyway, I'm just going to assume that you're all out there and still awake. In any case, when I say you guys have probably played some of the music of Holst, this first and second suites in E flat and F, and the Vaughan Williams folk song suite, and maybe some of the other more sophisticated pieces. But in any case, you might also notice, and you might have some other pieces of that era where it says military band. Okay, this was a term at the time that was used to signify bands with woodwinds, brass, and percussion. It had nothing to do with the military. There would be town military bands. There would be other kind of military bands. But basically, the British band tradition had been a 19th century tradition, a late 19th century tradition that had been the brass bands, all brass bands, being the fact that obviously they would be outside. They were able to perform outside. They would perform in we might call it band shell, but not really. We call it more gazebos or outside settings and things like that. So they were brass bands. So this was to delineate, calling it the military band. There would be brass bands. You'd have chamber groups and woodwind groups. You were starting to have, I wouldn't call them jazz bands, but bands that would perform popular music, perhaps for other occasions. But in this case, the only bands at that time, or up until that time in the early period, that would have a full complement of woodwinds, brass, and percussion were known as military bands. So it was just, hey, we've got a military band. Our company is sponsoring a military band. Our town has a military band, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we mean by the term military band. Let's go ahead and put up a couple of examples here. Let's see what numbers we have here. I've got, do I have the right sheet in front of me here? I believe we want to look at number 1 and number 2 on those photos, huh? Can we pull up number 1? Okay, this is the cover, and if we can make it a little bit bigger, maybe, if we can zoom in, I guess it can be seen. I'm looking at it from my iPad, guys, and those of you who are looking at it from a real computer, you've got a bigger screen than I do, so it's probably easier to see. But this is this from the British Museum and transferred now, it's in the British Library. But in any case, this is Gustav Holst's the cover to the original score for the suite in E flat. And you notice for some reason, and we're not quite sure, you see it said suite in E flat, and then he added first suite in E flat afterwards for military band, chaconne, intermezzo band. Let's go ahead and put the second one on, which is the first page of the chaconne. Okay. If you look at the instrumentation, you'll see a very limited instrumentation right there. And this was basically the instrumentation that you would see in the military band. And they didn't have things like Barry saxophones. And if you look, if you can see down in the bottom under, we've got euphonium and baritone and trombones, you'll see the instrument called the bombardon. That was an outdoor instrument that was sort of like a sousaphone, but you notice you see no tuba part. But this served the function of the tuba. It was sort of a funny looking sousaphone, so to speak. But that's what we had at the time. Ignore the bottom of the page where it says piano, because at that time, composers, what they did is they tried to make things easier for the people who were following those scores. And so basically what they would do, that it's not a piano part. There were no pianos in those bands, but basically if you were to have that band have the score realized for piano, that way it made it easier to analyze it. Obviously, Mr. Holst and some of those composers didn't have a whole lot of respect for the band conductors being able to transpose or do anything else like that. The other thing I want to point out is something now that we're going to get to, because this kind of has the metamorphosis of what Grainger was doing. So I'm going to back up a little bit right now. And let's take on those excerpts. I want to make an example of something. Let's take track number 49, if we may, and we'll just take a little bit of the opening. Now, this is not Grainger. This is the Gustav Holst first suite, which was at that time. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's wait before we put that on. I apologize. I'm moving too quickly. Let's back up just a second right here. Up to that time, those military bands were playing, in many cases, sometimes arrangements that were pretty crude arrangements, pretty elementary arrangements of popular music, and transcriptions. And they weren't great creative transcriptions, but they were transcriptions with a lot of doubling of the basic music of the orchestral repertoire. And the military bands were doing a lot of that. But they were also coming up with some very, very creative and well-written marches at this time. And but in terms of any sort of music of sophistication and of compositional depth and musical depth, there wasn't a whole lot being done, which is why in 1909, it was so important that we had a composer, the stature, the absolute stature of Gustav Holst, that would write a suite for band. And so this is a very, very important piece. But in terms of the band and what we were able to discover, Grainger at this same time that he sort of discovered band, but he was taking his folk song settings, which originally he was playing on the piano, and he was playing them as encores in many cases. And he was setting them, he got interested in setting them to instruments, and was doing so with combinations of instruments, and started doing some things with orchestra and making orchestral arrangements. And starting in about 1911, actually before that, starting in about 1908, he started doing some of his music and writing some of his music for orchestra. And guess what? About a year after he started doing that, he found out that there was another instrumental combination that he might write for. And at that time, even Holst himself wasn't quite sure what the potential was. So what Holst did was he was doing this, his early pieces in particular, what you find with the chaconne is he was writing for what he heard with the brass band. And we'll do that same chaconne, or we'll do the chaconne opening, and you'll hear this, which is writing like for the brass band, which is very dark, thinking about conical and cylindrical brass instruments. In other words, the difference between a baritone and a euphonium, and the difference between a cornet, conical, and the trumpet, cylindrical. He was writing for E-flat horns. So we had this sort of brass band sound on the opening. The other thing that Holst did when he wrote his first suite right there is when the woodwinds came in, you heard basically what you heard is some of the orchestral woodwind sounds that Holst had heard in the orchestra. Holst was a pretty interesting guy. His main gig was not composition. And everybody today knows Holst for most. If you were in front of me and I'd ask you to raise your hand and say, name other than a band piece, name perhaps Holst's most famous piece. Most hands that go up and they'd say, "The Planets." Every time I've done that and rehearsed the piece, I've asked kids that, and sure enough, that's what they come up with would be The Planets, which is very sophisticated scoring in the early 20th century. Well, in this case, however, that was not his main gig. Holst was an organist. He was at the St. Paul School for Girls. He was teaching general music, music theory, teaching everything, directing the choir, the Kapellmeister, the orchestra conductor. He was also a trombonist and played extra with the London Symphony. And so I maintain that some of those sounds that he did, in terms of the woodwinds themselves and how he became familiar, were the sounds that he heard in the orchestra, per se. But let's listen to a little bit of that, because I think then you're going to understand kind of Grainger's development, where he came from and where he went to. Let's go ahead and now go ahead and do that chaconne, a little bit of that 49. No. 48 then. This must be messed up. Here we go. 48. No, gosh. We better back up. I may have to have you look for something here. I thought I had that on there. Do I not? Let's see what 50 is. I apologize, guys. Do you have 50 going?
Hold on just 1 second. I found it on your listing. It's 47.
Okay, very good. No, that's the chamber music section of the chaconne on 47, but it's not what I want. I'm going to come to that in a minute.
Isn't Zoom great? I mean, this is almost as good as having a live rehearsal, isn't it?
Yeah.
You think it's track 50?
Well, I thought it was. No, it wouldn't be track 50 or 51. Okay, I'll tell you what. Let's come back to that, because I'm going to skip that and just assume that I've done that. And maybe you can find the opening of the chaconne on something while we put this on. Right now, what I want to do is the example that I wanted to use there is that Holst would do that. He would use those brass band sounds and then introduce the woodwinds of the ensemble. But he introduced those woodwinds in sort of an accompanimental thing to the brass. And then finally, he ventured out and let them be solos to where we're almost a chamber music type thing. Let's go ahead and try number 50. 50 would at least give us those woodwind sounds that Holst heard in the orchestra. Was that 50?
It will be.
No. No, let's go to the next one.
Yeah, I think some of these were mislabeled originally.
All right, do we have 50? Did you get to 51 yet? Oh my. Let's go to 52. Was that 51?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Then let's go to 47. 47 will give us what we want. No,
That's 47 festival.
47 will give us what we want, I think. Okay, this is our woodwind. This is what we want. This is what we want. Okay, that'll do it. Okay. All right, now what you heard right there was very, very transparent. And this is what Holtz wrote for the second section of his chaconne after that brass band style opening. I'm sorry I couldn't give you a better example of that. Maybe you've got time to try and find a version of that. But in any case, I want to use that example to show you what Grainger did, and this will be tracks number 8 and number 9. This was Grainger first started fooling around with the scoring for instruments of Irish Tune, which he had arranged earlier for piano. He first started doing it really for an orchestral arrangement and was fooling with some wind combinations back in 1911 because he was very interested and kind of charmed by what he heard by Gustav Holst. But it wasn't really until 1918, I believe it was, that he actually decided to go ahead and make a commitment and do a piece for band, a setting for band, which was Irish Tune from County Derry, which was his first one. Let's go ahead, before we put that on, let's go ahead and look at the score, which we have, let's see here, which is photo number, what is our photo number on there?
3.
Okay, that's number 3 in our photos. So let's go ahead and put that on there. Okay, here's the cover. And he sort of made some notes. He was sort of inventing his own score because a band score, nobody had ever really done much of a full score. The first one that he had ever seen was Holst, and it's questionable whether he had actually seen the way Holst did the score. So he kind of invented his own thing based on kind of half of it being transposed and half of it now, that he called a compressed score. Mr. Cipher, how many music ed majors do you have? How many music majors are out there that I'm speaking to today?
Oh, I would say we probably have about 35 music education majors.
Oh my, okay. All right. Well, what you're going to see, this is in Percy Grainger's hand, and you're going to see the way he has that. He's got several notes up there. Where it was collected, you'll notice under where it says Percy Aldrich Grainger, you'll see under there where it was collected and how he got it and what collection it was from. And he was very scholarly from that standpoint in terms of making sure that he had everything cataloged. If you look up at the top, there's a thing that says British Folk Music Settings. Off of his wax cylinders, he took and he cataloged for himself all of these things that he called British folk music settings. And so he had them all perfectly cataloged with all the melodic lines, the words, the various variations that were done on these things, how they were done. In some cases, he'll find that one folk tune had a different title than he thought it had. And what he had to do was decide, well, gee, it's the same tune and 2 or 3 people have given me different titles. Let's see how many times I hear it and how many times where I hear the actual title, how I can document it. So you'll see in some of his later works that he's given some pieces some other names. The other thing that you might find interesting is you notice he doesn't, although they were already singing using the words on this, Danny Boy. And the words didn't come from Ireland. They didn't come from Ireland themselves. The words to Danny Boy were actually taken from a Scottish poem. But in any case, it became very popular in Northern Ireland. Now, if you go to Northern Ireland, you'll know because of you may know some things about Irish history, the difference between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. Grainger was very much so that he thought that even though the British were ruling Northern Ireland, the county, depending on who you were, the actual Irish, which at one time had been Catholic, but the differences between the Catholic and Protestant had nothing to do, well, a bit perhaps, to do with religion, but eventually it had to do with politics. So you notice there's a little political thing here. This is not called Londonderry. Londonderry are what the British would call the town of Derry. And you can tell if you go up in Northern Ireland and if you're in the town, And then particularly if you're in the county, you'll know if you're in an Irish nationalist or a Catholic area because it'll say County Derry, or if in that part of it they will call County Londonderry. And in this case, Grainger, just because he was so much into people having their own ethnic identity, he never did ever call this Londonderry area. He did a different setting that he called County Derry Air, but he never did call it Londonderry. In any case, that's a bit of trivia that you don't necessarily need to know, but just a couple of things with regard to that. Now let's go back to what I was talking about in terms of this example right here, because this is Grainger venturing out. He's going to write his first band piece, but guess what he does with the first 32 bars? He scores it very much like a very dark, conical bore brass band piece. In fact, the brass band arrangement, the first 32 bars, is exactly the same, except he cheated a little bit here and he doubled some of the baritone parts in the low woodwinds, tenor saxophone and bass clarinet. Other than that, it's the brass band setting. Now let's go ahead and take these first 32 bars, because this is what he did, his first original work for military band, but as we know it, for concert band. You notice up near the top, it also says for military, it says for military band. Okay, let's go ahead and play the first 32 bars.
The sharing of audio on Zoom
Yeah.
is about as handy as a hole in a bucket, truly. So it just takes a little while to make it all happen.
Okay.
We're almost there now.
Wait till you're my age and your body will be that way. It takes a little while in the morning to make it happen. Okay. All right. Now you get an idea. That's the first 32 bars. Now, here's what he did. He's a little bit conservative right here. He's not going to feature the instruments that he had newly discovered, which he was most excited about, were the double reeds in particular, which he did here in the orchestra. But they didn't, up until this point, they served very, very little function and very little importance in military bands per se. But he tried to take the sounds that he heard inside the orchestra, and and use his friend Holst's example for doing that. And that's how he scored the woodwinds from that standpoint. So he hadn't really branched out. And so let's go ahead and take now the next section, which is, I had it at track number 10 in terms of my tracks, Mr. Cipher. Okay, this is the end of it. That's fine. No, that's fine. Okay. Okay. You get an idea. He hasn't really explored the full woodwind section. He's using them mainly in a very transparent setting, so to speak, like what he heard inside the orchestra and what he heard in the example that we played you earlier from Holst. From that standpoint. Okay, now here's what was going on. We had another thing. Now I'm going to kind of shift gears right here because we're going to talk about one other thing. Here's what happened. He had moved by this time, as we talked about. He had already moved from Germany and from Central Europe to London, and he was in that area. Well, around 1914, by this time, just a couple years later, things started happening. Even though the British were not yet involved with the First World War, it became inevitable that the war that had begun in Central and Eastern Europe was going to encompass all of Europe, and eventually it became World War I. But that started happening in 1914, 1915. Grainger wanted no part of that. He wanted no part of being in a world that had war. You know, he'd had some offers to come over and concertize and to do some things in the States. And so he decided to take advantage of that. And from that standpoint, he and his mother had moved. By this time, his mother was still with him and traveling with him. They moved to New York City. And at that time, the U.S. was very much isolationist, and nobody could ever imagine that the U.S. would ever enter into World War I by that time, 1914, 1915. That just wasn't going to happen. So anyway, he moved to the States. Well, they very much liked New York. He was invited right away to solo with, now we call it the New York Philharmonic, but then it was the New York Symphony, and a very important, the first really, really important American conductor was a guy by the name of Walter Damrosch, and Damrosch invited him to solo with the New York Symphony. He had done so, and it was a big hit, and people liked his playing. They liked what he was doing. They became very interested in his music because, as everybody knows, you know, America was a melting pot. And so by this time, you know, everybody was interested. They'd heard their own music that had passed down from their ancestors, but we still had those ethnic groups. Although it became the melting pot at that time, you know, New York, Boston, everything that you're aware, I'm sure you're aware from films and readings and stuff, people were still living in ethnic neighborhoods and things like that. So they were very much interested in his folk songs. He was very popular. So he was very happy in New York. He made a lot of connections. One of his connections through orchestral gigs was a guy by the name of Rocco Resta. And that's going to become important to him just a year or two later, because here's what happened. The U.S. got into the war around 1917. By this time, Grainger had actually already begun applying and working towards citizenship. But in any case, if you if you were an immigrant, even if you were an alien, so to speak, as long as you were a legal alien or a legal resident, you could be drafted, or as they called it then, conscripted into the army. And it became very clear that he was going to do this. So by this time, this friend that he had made, Rocco Resta, had gotten into the military and become the military band leader at Fort Hamilton. His brother became military band leader at West Point. And he said, well, here's what we'll do. You go ahead and let's find an instrument for you, and you can, and I'll put you in the band at Fort Hamilton. So he went out and bought an old soprano sax, never put a reed on it. And the very next day he became the soprano saxophone player at Fort Hamilton. There's a picture of him with his new soprano saxophone. Thank you for putting that on and saving me the thing. And that's his mother there, continuing to protect him, or protecting herself from the sunshine. Anyway, there he is in his new band uniform with his new soprano saxophone. Okay, during that time, now we're going to get into another thing that happened. The bands that he had known and become familiar with were all very much in Europe, were all very much amateur bands. And he heard a band in his time in New York City and other places with the best of the best players in America. And that was called Sousa's Band. Just very simply, Sousa's Band, the band of John Philip Sousa. And unbeknownst to Grainger, Sousa was very much interested in Grainger's tunes, which had become very popular in their piano versions. And so what ended up happening is Sousa started doing arrangements of Grainger's music. So let's go ahead and put those photos up here. No, not Shepherd's A. Let's put up number 5. Do you have number 5? Okay, let's take a look at this. All right, you see this? And look at the date on here. Sousa contacted him, or was very much interested, and he'd heard this piece, Molly on the Shore, and Grainger was very, very excited. And he had sent him this score to Molly on the Shore for orchestra, and said, oh, you've heard this piece? I've actually done an orchestral setting. So anyway, he gave this sent this to Sousa, to John Philip Sousa in deep admiration. It's creative and artistic, Percy Grainger, October 1915. Okay, this is really, really interesting to us. And the reason it's interesting is Sousa then, he was trying to get Sousa basically to do arrangements of his music. He still obviously wasn't ready himself. He hadn't done a band setting until 1918. So he did that. Let's go ahead and put the next slide on there. Now, this was shortly thereafter, which is in October of 1915, from the New York Hippodrome. The M and the E is left out of this letter, but here he is. Please, sorry you weren't there at the concert last Sunday to hear Shepherd's Hay, another Sousa arrangement of Grainger's music, Shepherd's Hay. Okay, we've played, here's Molly. We've played Handel in the Strand several times, etc., etc. I'll play Shepherd's Hay. You can read this yourself. And then he said, I will have my librarian hunt up some programs containing Shepherd's Hay and send them to you. His own arrangements. Now notice this is 1915. And the great Sousa Band, the very famous Sousa Band, was already playing the music of Percy Grainger. So Grainger did in 1918, he did Irish Tune. And then he did his own Shepherd's Hay by this time. And then he had done 2 pieces. He'd done 2 pieces for band. This next piece, I think, doesn't get all the respect that it should. And that is that right after he wrote those 2, he wrote an arrangement of Colonial Song, which is still very basic. And the very next year, 1919, he decided to go ahead and let's see what we can do. Let's see if we can now start doing some new sounds. So he did his Children's March, which is Over the Hills and Far Away. And you were able to find an opening on that. I had left those out of my excerpts there, and Mr. Seifert kindly found an opening. But I want you to hear this, because you're going to hear bassoons, you're going to hear low saxophones for the first time. You're going to hear low woodwinds. There's even a sarrusophone part. Let's go ahead and let's go ahead and see if we can get the opening of Children's March on there. And let's get it up at a volume so everybody can hear those low woodwind growls. There we go. Oh my, that's an old one. Okay, that's enough right there. Okay, we heard that opening with the English horn as the lead voice. Then we got into the main thematic material, and guess who introduced that? Now we've got the bassoons introducing that. So we're just a year into his writing for band, 1919, and he's going ahead and taking those chances and doing all of those things that he did. Now let's talk about a different thing that was going on in terms of the history of bands, and that is right around this time, because of the influence of Sousa. Well, it's actually because of a number of things, and that is during the Civil War, people came home after the Civil War in the 19th century, and there had actually been bands. Patrick Gilmore, who was originally from Ireland, brought the concept of bands over from Ireland and the British Isles, and was in charge of military music for the North during the Civil War. And so we ended up having mostly and mainly brass bands, but other bands. And after the war was over, people came back to their towns, and they started coming up with having these little town bands. And it was basically a thing where fathers would teach their sons the instruments, et cetera, et cetera. But there was some interest, and there was interest in military music. A few towns had town bands. The first real town band that we know of, or that became pretty sophisticated and pretty well organized, was in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And the Allentown band today is one of the most flourishing. It's actually become, in these days, a professional band, and continues to play a pretty full set of concerts in the East. Is pretty well known. In any case, by this time now, people were interested. It's like we want bands to be part of our community. This is an opportunity for music to be part of our community, for enriching the community, enriching the arts, for teaching our kids this. And so in 1905, Albert Austin Harding took over as director of bands. He didn't take over. He just sort of, what had been a group of student musicians, organized them in some sense at the University of Illinois, and they asked him to stay on. Well, he stayed on from 1905 and hung around until 1948. And the influence that he had was influence in terms of providing a model. As schools became interested, and school districts became interested in having band programs. So that's when we had some of the early band programs, and they used Harding's Illinois band as a model, and Harding mentored a number of people through the upper Midwest, and then he sent out his disciples really all over the country. And so you're going to find that some of the early great band directors, and the most famous of the early band directors in the first quarter of the 20th century, in the first actually third of the 20th century, did not major in music in many cases. Originally, they went back and got degrees in music. Harding's degree was not in music. Mark Hinesley's degree was not in music. Glenncliff Bainham's degree was not in music. And these were the early leaders of the band programs. And with that came very quickly became very sophisticated band programs. I had mentioned before that the transcriptions that bands were using, the arrangements of orchestral pieces, were basically, a lot of doubling, not very sophisticated. They didn't really use some of the harmonies that were presented to them, and they tended to play mainly music of the 19th century, of the Romantic era, and in many cases substituted some of the more colorful chords that Berlioz began giving us, and that Wagner began giving us, and things like that, with very basic chord structures. But as bands got better, that now all of a sudden we have a need for repertoire. Well, the early repertoire, there were not a lot of composers who were interested in writing for bands, who were even aware of what was going on in bands, because the great composers were not here in the US yet. So the repertoire became arrangements, transcriptions. Harding himself became probably the first of the big time transcribers and arrangers. And by this time, some of the British military bands, a few of the actual military people, were doing better transcriptions. There was Kneller Hall was a school that trained British musicians, and they had pretty sophisticated theory classes. The Navy School of Music modeled itself after when it was started in Virginia, modeled itself after Kneller Hall in London. In any case, that now you have Harding transcribing, and then you have other people like his disciples, like Glenncliff Bainham at Northwestern, and Hinesley, who was an assistant of his at Illinois, and they began really studying and perfecting, or at least developing, the art of the transcription and the school band movement. In any case, bands started flourishing. By this time, you had, in the early 20s, you had the National Music Camp at Interlochen was formed by Joe Matty. You had things like that. There were gigs. Hey, it wasn't just going out and playing the Grieg piano concerto, and Grainger's most popular tune, which he grew to hate, was a tune called Country Gardens. As an assignment, Mr. Seifert, I'm going to recommend that you make everybody listen to 4 different versions of Country Gardens. Okay, just find the original piano version, which became a very popular piece, and Grainger came to hate it because it was his own popular piece, and no matter what he was playing, no matter what piano concerto he was playing, and in many cases he played the Grieg more than anything, he was expected to play Country Gardens somewhere along the line, and he got tired of doing it. So he learned to hate it. In fact, in his later concerts, he would invent different dissonances to throw in there and change the chord structure just as a little protest for doing that. But in any case, we had a lot of things. He went to a lot of places, visited a lot of places. His music became very popular. Back over in Europe, Richard Strauss was actually conducting some of Grainger's music in Austria and Germany. Some of the other pieces, Leopold Stokowski became interested in his music and was performing the music of Grainger, and some of the other conductors such as that. By the way, another interesting thing is, I had mentioned Grainger coming to resent the Europeans. And shortly after Grainger no longer, in 1918, Grainger was really only in the military for a year, or in the military band. And I'm not sure even how much he showed up in uniform. But in any case, when the war was over, all of those conscripts were released from duty. And the first gig that he was offered the gig as conductor of the St. Louis Symphony, and they wanted to start a symphony school of music. And he turned it down because to conduct a symphony orchestra, he would be expected to play too much of the music of the romantic German and Austria conductors, and he refused to play their music by this time. So that's a little piece of trivia, that he was offered the St. Louis Symphony conducting gig. So in any case, he was doing a lot of guest appearances, guest conducting, soloing, not just with professionals. He performed with the Chicago Symphony a number of times, but especially he became very interested in what bands were doing and in the different sounds and colors. And the beauty of school bands, and particularly university bands, is he saw that as a vehicle to expand, because he became more and more interested in non-traditional instruments. He embraced the saxophone because he never grew up hearing any saxophones, and never heard any great saxophone players until the early 20th century. And it's like, gee, this is a different sound, and this is a different voice. And this reminds me of some of the different kind of sounds that we get from the human singing voice. It reminds me in some cases of some of the sounds I heard from some of those folk singers who I collected in the wax discs or wax cylinders. And in hearing some of those, I'm not sure if he's complimenting or insulting the sound of the saxophone. But when you hear some of those folk singers, but in any case, he loved those sounds. He loved the English horn. He loved the baritone oboe, which is gone. Basically, it's become extinct. But in any case, Holtz wrote a very important baritone oboe part, of course, in the Planets, and the heckelphone, which Strauss used quite often, the heckelphone itself, and the sarrusophone. And so, in any case, because of Interlaken, he came to know a lot of not only professional musicians who enjoyed spending their summers up in Michigan at Interlaken at the National Music Camp, which eventually sort of became the International Music Camp, although it was never called that. In any case, so in any case, that led to a lot of the places that he went to, and a lot of the places that he became friendly with different musicians and conductors. We're going back now again to Albert Austin Harding. And one of the things I have to tell you, one of the great things that I've discovered shortly after going to the University of Illinois in 1985 was of course, the archives. And all of those things were kept in the correspondences and the letters, and finding all of those things that existed at that time in those archives. And so he had been on the Illinois campus. One report said he'd been on the Illinois campus on 5 different occasions. Another said 7 different occasions. I think the only thing I could find record of were about 5 different occasions. But I want to put a couple of photos up here of some things that you had right here. Let's go ahead and take let's go ahead and take photo number 7. Okay, this is a letter to Albert Austin Harding, who was by this time, Grainger had settled in White Plains, New York, and that address in 7 Cromwell Place, that house still exists. It's still the Grainger home. It's in a trust, and I've been fortunate to be there at the Grainger home and spend some time there doing research on a sabbatical, and I was at the Grainger home 3 times. I'm pleased to say that they were able to get some grant money and through some donations, and they were able to do some badly needed restoration the Grainger home, and some of the instruments we'll get to in a few minutes. Grainger's piano is there. His beloved harmonium was and still is there, and many files and things. Some of them, because it wasn't well kept during the year, some of those files are missing some very important historical items, I'm sorry to say. In any case, this is from the U of I files, and you'll see this letter. You've probably read it already. This is some interesting information here, in the sense that you'll notice that he sent his train schedule at this time to Albert Austin Harding. Here's his schedule for the train. And it says, now this is important, arrive Tolono, 7:31 a.m., leave Tolono. He was transferring, in any case, transferring trains from the Wabash line to the Illini coach line at that time, transferring trains. However, let me come back to this for just a second. As I mentioned before, Grainger was a very interesting character there. He was he loved sports, but he loved when he was a boy in Australia, he loved viewing the popular Australian sports and the British sports. But he was very much interested and very much loved track and field. He loved walking. He loved physical exercise. He was a swimming nut. He loved horseback riding and things like that. He became bored. You can go ahead and keep that letter up if you would. Okay, he became very bored on his coach trip. And you're going to notice something here. You see where it says arrive Tolono, leave Tolono. Tolono was a little town about 25 miles south of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. He was to be picked up at the train station at 7:35 in the morning, a few minutes shortly after. That's or 7:38, I think it is. And then it transferred over to Urbana. And he was being picked up in Urbana shortly after 8 o'clock by Ray Dvorak, who later became very famous as the band director for many, many years at the University of Wisconsin. But Ray Dvorak at that time was Harding's assistant. And Dvorak waited and checked the train, went up into the train, legend has it, and no Grainger. He came back and told Harding, he said, there was no Grainger on that train. He didn't show. Well, Grainger was bored, and at that time he was restless. He'd been on the train for quite some time, and he decided at Tolono that he would get off the train and walk or jog or hike or whatever one would do, or whatever Grainger would do. So those last 24 miles, he decided not to take the train. He decided to go ahead and run and hike. They had an afternoon rehearsal in the afternoon. Still no Grainger. And now this was with the orchestra. He was doing something with the orchestra and the band. He was supposed to be playing the Grieg piano concerto. And rehearsal had just started, and Harding was startled because he turned from the podium, because he heard this noise behind him, turned from the podium and saw this guy leaping up, didn't use the stairs at that time, leaping up from the floor to the stage, right next to the piano, and there was Grainger, ready to go. So it's a very, very famous story. But anyway, you'll notice that, well, in any case, let's go ahead. The next one's page 2. I don't know that we need to get to that, but let's go ahead and take the next letter. Here's the next one, which he said, this is important. Yeah, this is before he arrived. This is when he was telling him that he'd already made his hotel reservations, and that's where he was. Let's go to the next letter. Okay, now this one's kind of interesting here, because you're going to see something. I'm sorry. Before we get to this next letter here, and which is going to be kind of our, in some ways, kind of our introduction to Lincolnshire Posey, his most famous piece. But in any case, the other interesting thing is a couple of the letters that existed in the files is it appears that he wrote another letter afterwards to Harding, and I should have printed that up too. But in any case, he lost his raincoat, and he must have left his raincoat there. Well, they checked and they didn't find his raincoat, except what they did is find some photos that were taken of him, and they never had his raincoat in there. And they figured out that his raincoat, he didn't have it with him when he showed up on the stage and left his things back in the seats there at the old university auditorium. So they figured out he must have left that raincoat on the train there when he took off to walk to Toronto. But it's really kind of funny because there was all this back and forth stuff going on there with the famous raincoat. All right, there's two reasons why this letter is important. Here's a letter here from 1937 from Harding to Grainger. It's important for two reasons. If you'll notice in the third paragraph, well, in the second paragraph, it refers to a piece of Grainger's that's, even though it's called a march, it's not really a march. It's sort of a, it's sort of have a style of a march, but it's more of an overture called The Lads of Wamfray. That'd be another assignment in terms of listening to that piece, The Lads of Wamfray. But in any case, you notice that Harding was really, really interested in those other instruments too. And so in the third paragraph, you'll see that he's suggesting to Grainger that he might write parts for baritone oboe and heckophone, basset horn, which are used in the Mozart serenades, which is sort of like an alto clarinet except in F, English horns, all of those things like that. And would he consider writing parts for those? Well, Grainger first wrote him a letter, a follow-up letter saying he had some interest in him and was going to consider it. And then by that time, some of his pieces had already been published. The pieces that we're talking about were already in the process of being published, and he didn't want to deal with that. And anyway, that never came to be. However, we're gonna get something very, very interesting right here, because you're gonna look in the last paragraph here. It says, I'm sorry, the last paragraph of that page. Yeah, I enjoyed very much the short visit I had with you and Mrs. Grainger in Milwaukee, and I'm sorry that time to now, this is an important sentence. I hope that it was not necessary for you to again go through such an ordeal in preparation for a concert as in Milwaukee. Remember that in 1937, Harding is apologizing to him that, or commiserate, not apologizing, there was no reason for him to, but commiserating with him for that. And so I want you to remember that. We're going to come back to that in a second. Okay. Now let's talk about, I talked about the various stages. Right now, Grainger started to realize by this time, we're into the 1930s, and in the 20s, by this time, Grainger had already done and rescored a lot of his piano pieces, and they became very popular and staples of the band repertoire, which up to that time, really an original repertoire didn't exist. And so he did settings such as Ye Banks Embrace a Bonnie Doon and Spoon River, the Children's March, as we mentioned before, Molly on the Shore, et cetera, et cetera. Now we get to a piece where Grainger has decided to really, really expand. And before we get to that, no, I'll tell you what, I'll do that. I'll talk about the next thing afterwards. Let's go ahead and start this. So the piece that he really wanted to expand with is the piece that he had always wanted to write. And that is between 1906 and 1908, in collecting those wax cylinders of the folk songs. And it might be interesting, since you have all of those recordings and you've got them, Mr. Seifert, is, maybe on another time or a later occasion or before or after in the next rehearsal after, to go ahead and put those online for the students so that they can hear all the ones that are available right there of the different folk singers. Okay. In any case, Grainger he'd taken his 6 favorite folk songs, and he was not only very interested in that, but he was interested in studying the derivations of folk songs, the people who were doing it, the kind of people, in many cases, they were leading townsfolks, but in other cases, they were vagrants. They were people living in the park. They were people living in rest homes or in I'm trying to think of what they were called. I think they were called public. It was public housing, but basically they were sort of put in slums and in what we would call housing projects and things like that. But anyway, he found some interesting characters, and he enjoyed very much. He enjoyed meeting these people, and in many cases, the character of those people. So in a few cases, it's people who were land barons, people who worked on land, just every imaginable type of person that you could think of. So anyway, some of these folk songs, he put together 6 of them, and he put it in his piece that he considered his masterpiece, and that's Lincolnshire Posy. And I believe you gave them Lincolnshire Posy as an assignment to listen to. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, you had a chance to listen to it. I haven't talked this much in a long time, so excuse me, but I'm gonna get a drink of water here. And in the process, maybe I can get you to, we don't need to go through all the singers, but let's go ahead and look at what do I want to have you listen to? You've got all the recordings of the folk singers, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Let's listen to a little bit of I'll tell you what, let's skip ahead because you're going to find this interesting. We have two pretty basic folk songs, and that is, can you go ahead and find the first movement? In the published version, you'll notice in his score, he called it Dublin Bay. And then he found out later on that it was it was based on some, the words were based on some other things. It was called Lisbon. It was a sailor song, yes, but it was about these sailors that had gone out and more or less these explorers. And they named the song after Lisbon. So you'll find in the most recent edition of Lincolnshire Posy, it'll say Lisbon, but in his score, it says Dublin Bay. Can you play some of the opening there?
I can play the opening of the band playing that. That is not.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
And we won't play much of it, just so they get to recognize it.
Just a moment. You might even get a free YouTube commercial here. I know everyone's missing.
In over 100 years, we've never missed a payment. Guaranteed monthly income for life.
Hey, that's what I need. Now, Grainger wrote a little counter melody. Here it is. Okay, so let's stop it. Now, what you heard, the last bum, 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 this is what Grainger did, and this is what made his music so original. He took these simple folk tunes and he wrote counter melodies. In some cases, he wrote other counter melodies. He wrote counter melodies based on other folk tunes. And that little fanfare that you heard here was on a tune called Lord Melbourne, which was an important thing. And another part of Lord Melbourne, you'll hear later on, that became a movement in itself. But this part of Lord Melbourne was called the Duke of Marlborough. And so he used it as a counter melody for his first piece. Now, do you have, I know you've got your thing of the folk singers, and I'm going to hit you with this by surprise because I forgot to have you do this. When I gave you all these materials, this is a boo-boo. Can you find your version of the opening of Porkstow Grange with the singer?
I'll see what I can do.
Meanwhile, while he's looking for that, here's what I might mention to you. In the introduction, and it's several pages of program notes, he tells you not only about what each of those little pieces were about, but about the singer itself. And in the case of the second movement, which is Rufford Park Poachers, you're going to hear the folk tune, which moves along and is very simple, but yet he wrote this beautiful, lush, romantic tune. And what he was trying to simulate with this was the personality. So some of Lincolnshire is about the music itself. Some of it is about the words because it's very much text driven. And some of it is to depict the personality of the singers. So let's see if we can get that, if we can hear the folk singer.
You know, so grandparents, you know, my dear, you all do know in the garbage there. His chin and his manders, lamps and folding, there, pollution that is there.
Okay. Okay. Now, this has no bridge. That's the whole thing. You're just going to hear the same strain with different words, just repeated and repeated and repeated. So Grainger wrote a very interesting bridge for this, but you're also going to know, going to hear, when you hear the opening of Rufford Park, you're not going to hear, you're going to hear this very lush, romantic rubato piece, which was to depict the folk singer himself. Let's go ahead and put on number 11. And if this doesn't work, you can put on maybe the second movement of the recording that you just used. That's an oldie. That's not from the Carnegie Hall concert, was it?
No.
Yeah.
I have number 11 here.
Okay. Okay. All right. Now you get a little piece of that. You've got it already. You've looked it up as an assignment. I invite you to listen to the whole thing again and think of that as the personality of the singer. Now we go on to the next movement, Rufford Park Poachers, and he does something very, very interesting because he writes the beginning and the ending in canon. He writes it in canon, so you're going to hear the separation between the two voices. But let's go ahead and let's go back to the folk singer and let's see if we can hear the folk singer himself singing this. And what I want you to listen for on this, is the fact that as he repeats it, he does two things. He changes the pitches and he also changes the rhythms. You know, it's obviously a very uneducated musician, but very interesting man. And this was said to be Grainger's favorite of his folk singers. Let's go ahead and do this. I think this was George Ray. Go ahead. Now let's go ahead and take it off. Now, here's what he did. You're going to hear this, and pardon my singing, it's not any better than the folk sing. Ya da 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 dum, ya da 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 dum. You're going to hear 4/16 and a half step. You're going up to the E flat. Ya da 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 dum. And then when he does his canon at the end as a coda to emulate or simulate the how should I say it, the differences in the singer or the erratic nature of the singer, he da ya da dum, he writes it as a triplet and a full step, rather ya da da dum, da ya da dum. Okay, you're going to hear it that way. So let's go ahead and we should be able to do that. Let's go ahead and take the opening canon, which would be number 13. Let's go ahead and do that. Yeah, and listen to your recording at the end, and you'll hear at the end, and I don't have it on here. I left it off. I just realized that. You'll hear the triplet and you'll hear the whole step when you hear it at the end. And by the way, my tempo was too fast in that. But
I thought so.
yeah, well, what do you know? Anyway, yeah. Oh, I'm really disappointed because now when I make fun of you and I don't get to hear them laugh right here. That's one of the really bad parts about this. I guess I'll be nice to you in that case. Here we go. All right, now another thing that Grainger did is Grainger used an instrument at home for a lot of his compositions, and particularly for Lincolnshire Posy. And the instrument that he used was a harmonium. And I don't know how much you guys know about the harmonium itself, but the harmonium is an instrument it's kind of a cross between an organ and bagpipes. In that what you were doing is constantly pumping air in the instrument. And when you hear some of this, you'll hear some clicks, pumping air in. And it's sometimes you'll find a harmonium stuck someplace in a back room of an old church, because a lot of churches in the early part of the 20th century were using harmoniums and continued actually to use them in some of these little country churches and stuff really into the 50s. But it's very much like some of these small home organs. And one of the most interesting movements of this was the fifth movement, or Lord Melbourne, which he subtitled the war song. But in this case, he wanted very, very bold sounds. But this is where he really went on a limb harmonically. And to show how important that was to you, from the Library of Congress, there's a recording that it came and that was made. And let's see if I can find the right one. And you're going to hear this. This is actually Percy Grainger himself. Also, the other thing that Percy became interested in was odd meters when nobody else was playing odd meters at that time. Everything was basically standard meters, and in many cases non-meters, because what he felt like we were losing some of the great freedom of music. And that's the other thing he loved about the folk singers, the freedom, not the fact that they were uneducated, non-educated, or unsophisticated musician, but the great freedom that they sang with, and the freedom of their rhythms, which basically was one of the sad things that when we went from medieval to the Renaissance. It's one of the sad things that happened when we started in talking about metric music and strict metered music. But in any case, he strove for that sort of freedom of rhythm. So this is free rhythms on the opening of this. I'll go ahead and we'll play some of this, and then I'm going to back up. Let's go ahead and play. First, let's play George Ray Singing, which is track number 17. Let's go ahead and put that on. You got it? There we go.
My battle of Melbourne is my name. In 7th year I fought to breath up, late of noonday. I was below.
Somehow I lost you here.
I just think you touched your video off. I still hear you.
Well, I did. Somebody sent me. I'm trying to get it back on here. Anyway, while I'm doing that, let's go ahead now. Here is Grainger. Let's go ahead and put track 18 on. I'll try and find you here. You got it? I'm not sure how to get this video back on, to be honest with you. Do we have track 18 on?
Yep, we just listened to track 18. It was really cool.
Okay, here's the problem. I'm showing my age here. I don't know how to get this back on again.
Are you on an iPad?
Yeah.
The bottom right, you should see the video button. It'll look like it looks like a camera.
There we go. There we go.
Yep.
There we go. Yeah. Okay. All right. So everybody heard 18. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Now that's Grainger's version. Now here's what he wrote for Winds, and here's the Wind Band version. Let's go ahead and put on 19 now. Okay, now what we're trying to do. Okay. All right, that's enough of that. Now what we're trying to do there is also, and it's, when I get to the next section, it's going to be even more obvious. I wanted to hear the full sounds of those full chords, and not just but the full sounds and the full chords. And we're trying to realize that in there. Let's go ahead and put on number 20, because you'll get the idea of the free section. Now you hear the soloist in the middle, which is a bunch of changes of meters right here, trying to make it as free as possible. We got 20 on, here we go. Should keep going. Is that middle section on there? Is that 20? Was that 20? That should have been number 20. I'm not getting any sound from you right now.
I can go get the recording from Carnegie Hall.
Okay, well, let's not worry about that. Let's go ahead and skip ahead, because I'm seeing what time it is. Let's skip ahead on that. You just need to know, they can listen to the recording and they'll hear that middle section, and they'll know that that's the free section that comes with the soloist after that free stuff. That should have been the rest of number 20 on there, because I've used this before for clinics. So in any case, let's skip ahead. Now Grainger is doing the harmonium, but we're going to get a chance to do something here, because we should hear Grainger singing on this next one. Let's put 22 on, and here's Grainger singing and playing. And besides his singing, what I want you really listening for is the way he really stretches his fingers to block out these big sophisticated chords on this, and the way he writes this in the score. You see this big lush chord, like with all of those with 4 octaves, like an organ. Let's go ahead and listen to this. Okay. Now, notice in this case, what was really important to him in this case had nothing to do with linear stuff. It all had to do with those big, lush, organ-like chords. So here's what I tried to do with this. I wanted those last 3 chords, I wanted to simulate, to emulate the sound of the organ as much as possible. So we spent a lot of rehearsal time. And Mr. Seifert will be rehearsing some things with you, and he'll be stopping and balancing chords to try and get that sound in his ear, the particular sound that he wants to hear. Music majors, when you're studying a score and you're getting ready to conduct it, or you're getting ready to rehearse it in any way, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get that sound. You're trying to get that sound in your head. You're trying to get the balance of the chords and the sound in your head, and you're trying to make that happen. And this is what we were trying to do. Let's go ahead and take number 27, which should be the whole last section. Let's take number 27. Now, excerpt number 28 are those last 3 chords. I want you to just listen to these last 3 and close your eyes. Not imagine that we have to have it balanced and voiced so that you hear an organ. Hopefully, we sound as close to an organ in the wonderful hall as we possibly can on these last three chords. Part of it is being fortunate enough to play in a great hall, by the way. Last 3 chords. Okay, well, I hope you got the idea. That's Grainger's favorite piece. The last piece is a pretty basic folk song, is a dance movement called The Lost Lady Found, and it's a fun dance movement. When we get done here, the next time, go ahead and listen to the entire Lincolnshire Posy. Keep in mind those voices, the folk singers. I hope you'll have those folk singers available to them, the recordings of those pieces, that you'll make those available to Mr.
Yes.
Seifert. And
Yes.
that would be great. And those last things there. One of the things I want to talk about, I want to open this up because I know you're gonna have to have some questions, but I want to sort of wrap this up. This was Grainger's favorite piece, and anybody that has any doubt about it just needs to check. Let's put a couple more of those letters on there. Let's see what we have here. Let's. Oh, I said I was going to come back to that story, and I have to tell you that story and what that was all about. And I apologize here. Yeah, if you look at this last paragraph, you'll see. I hope that it wasn't necessary for you to go through such an ordeal in preparation for a concert. What I didn't tell you is on the premiere of Lincolnshire Posy, it was done at the concert of the American Bandmasters Association, and basically what that was at the ABA is the piece was completed and it was premiered in 1937, and right after the first of the year, at the ABA convention, which was held in Milwaukee. Well, Grainger conducted like a wild man, and none of these musicians had ever seen free time, free music, odd meters, all of those things that were involved. And Grainger looked like a wild man conducting anyway, because he was an untrained conductor. And it was a very frustrating experience. So what happened was the band itself, the band that was used to do that, was a band that was sponsored. It was a professional band or a semi-pro band, or more like a community band. And it was in Milwaukee, and the band was the Pabst Blue Ribbon Band, which was the Pabst Brewing Company sponsored a band. And whether or not, I have no idea if it was their employees or not, but anyway, they couldn't play the piece. And so they ended up just doing 3 movements, the 3 easier movements on the concert. Grainger was very, very frustrated. So that's what it refers to. Then Grainger went back to the publisher. He'd already submitted the score to the publisher, to G. Shermer. And he went back to the publisher and he added something. He had, as I said before, he already had about 5 pages of program notes. This had nothing to do with the program notes. It's a little note to the band leader that he asked G. Shermer to add to that. And if you read this, you're going to see something here. You're going to see something here that band leaders not afraid of 2 types of regular music, those conveyed by changing time signatures in Rufford Park poachers, and those marked free time left to the band leader's volition in Lord Melbourne. Both these types are well within the powers of any normal high school band. The only players that are likely to balk at those rhythms are seasoned professional bandsmen who think more of their beer than of their music. So that was added to the errata. You'll notice the errata up top when he changed Dublin Bay to Lisbon, Harkstow Grange to Horkstow Grange. But at the end of that first paragraph, that last sentence is beautiful. And that's why Grainger added that errata and that extra set of notes back there. So that's kind of what that's all about. There's a couple more letters that you might put online for him. You notice, I think Harding was afraid to play it. You'll notice here, dear Dr. Harding has shot to send you the parts of my Lincolnshire Posy. As I published by the, has it arrived safely? Okay, and so that was in 1940. Now, next letter. Okay, Harding's secretary said, yeah, they arrived. I need more parts. At that time, there weren't photocopy machines and things like that. So he needed more parts because it was a very large band. He was going to give it a reading. Now, the next letter. Somehow it never got performed. And I think I know why, because Harding was pretty traditional and they were afraid to do it. Now, here is something. I was glad to hear from your secretary, the safe arrival of Lincolnshire Posy. I only bring this up because it says, which I ordered to be sent for you because I consider it my best composition for band. Now let's go to the letter from a couple of years later, 1943. Dear Dr. Harding, did I ever send you the score and parts of my Lincolnshire Posy for band? I meant to, as I consider it my very best band composition, but I can't remember if I did or not. Okay. So obviously Harding did not perform it. And back in the archives and the old programs, we found that it didn't get performed. In fact, Posy never got performed at Illinois till sometime in the 50s. So that's all about that, and that's his piece. Meanwhile, other things, you saw a picture of a sarrusophone trio, Grainger and his wife and another guy playing a sarrusophone trio. Do we have that? There we go. Probably the only time you've seen pictures of sarrusophones being played at that time. Okay. Now, you'll notice at that time, there's a couple of other things that Grainger was very much into and experimenting. Besides free time, he liked free music. He wanted to experiment. He knew that some things were going on with some people where they were trying to do things with experimental sounds, the beginnings of electronic music and things like that. So he was very much taken by, in the 40s and 50s, a couple of things that he called his free music machines, where he tried to have machines doing indeterminate things. Here's one picture of one of the machines he wrote, trying to get music cranked out on a machine. And I think I put another one in there, didn't I, Mr. Cipher, of another one of his free music machines? Do we have one? Yeah. Okay, there's another thing. And there are several examples of some things. He was an inventor, that he was trying to invent for music, trying to invent, in many cases, some instruments, some electronic type instruments, the precursor for synthesizer and synthesized music. That's what he did basically and mostly in his later years, rather than new compositions. And these were in the 40s and the 50s. He was very much interested in that. And to fund that, he rescored a lot of his pieces that he had never done for band for various settings, basically to make money and fund it. He didn't do that Country Gardens, that piece that I talked about that he had to play, which is his first popular piano piece, kind of a light thing. He had to play so often. He finally, as much as he hated doing it, he finally did his own band arrangement in 1948, which is pretty interesting since John Philip Sousa wrote an arrangement of Country Gardens in 1916.
Yeah.
So it took him, it took him 32 years to do his own arrangement of Country Gardens. He passed away in 1961, White Plains, New York. And if you ever get up that way, that the Grainger house is on Cromwell Place. And it's on the address that's on that letterhead on that stationery. So basically, so much is the history of music. I feel like Lincolnshire Posey, in terms of the history of bands, I feel like Lincolnshire Posey took us through basically that Grainger took us through from transcriptions to arrangements of popular music, to settings for band of pieces that had otherwise been done, like transcriptions, to original works for bands, to a piece like Lincolnshire Posey, which is definitely an original work, because the one thing that you have is, of those 6 movements, in every case, all he did was take the basic theme that was sung by the folk singers, redo it right in almost every case, wrote his own bridge, wrote his own counter melodies, wrote his own harmonies, wrote his own motives, wrote his own other themes, inserted other pieces in juxtaposition, which is a very popular, I shouldn't say popular, but it's a widely used technique by composers. And then what we ended up with Lincolnshire Posey is people started taking a chance in the band world with odd meters, with mixed meters, with dissonances, with advanced harmonies. And then the band movement took off from that time, post-World War II to what we have today. And so Grainger, in some cases, was a metaphor for the development of bands in the 20th century. So in any case, I know we've got a few minutes here for a few questions. Let's go ahead and do that.
Well, Mr. Keene, thank you for a fantastic presentation about Percy Grainger and his music. I wanted to ask one question to you about the letter where Harding once again essentially states, or Grainger asks Harding essentially why he hasn't played Lincolnshire Posey, and Harding responds with something about the band being involved in a band clinic. Can you tell them what that band clinic was?
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. As I mentioned before, the the band movement was pretty much led by Harding. The American School Band Directors Association has an award that they give that's kind of a lifetime achievement award, and it's the A. Harding Award, which is a big deal. And basically, as I mentioned before, in terms of the band movement and the bands in the public schools, Harding mentored a lot of people. He started sending people out into the schools. He taught them, basically he taught them how to be band directors and how to build programs and how to build band programs and develop band programs. And he had the first band clinic where he would bring in instrumental specialists. He would have various bands that he would invite to come perform, and people would come to that clinic. That clinic was suspended during World War II. And shortly after World War II, the Illinois band program, basically Harding was winding down his career, and Mark Hinesley was to take over in 1948, and he was winding that down. And during World War II, they suspended the band clinics. Well, right after World War II, a lot of the instrument manufacturers, publishers, and various people like that said, that band clinic was a great thing, but we can do more with it, and we can develop it ourselves, and we can help advertise, and we can do this, but we need a bigger place than Champaign, Urbana, Illinois. Let's go ahead and do a clinic and do it up in Chicago. In 1948, that's when you had the Midwest Clinic. But basically, the concept for the Midwest Clinic and that whole concept was started with the Illinois band clinics back in the 20s. And at the end of the clinic, the Illinois band would give a concert. They'd invite a couple of high school bands. They would have some rehearsals. They would have some of the instrumental staff would do clinics, and directors and kids would come, and they'd put about 3,000 people on the Illinois campus.
And now this year with the pandemic in place, I think our students can attend the Midwest Clinic virtually, which won't be as good as it normally is, but at least it's a gateway and a pathway to attending the Midwest Clinic. If that's something that our students are interested in doing, they should visit midwestclinic.org.
Yeah, I'd recommend that they go ahead and invest that little bit of time and a little bit of money. I don't know what they're charging students. It seems to me it's only about 25 or 35 bucks for a student, and I don't know what it is. I do that. I'd also invite them to look into, in February, the Texas Music Educators Clinic, Association Clinic, which will also be virtual, and it's the second week in February, which is huge. It's almost as big as Midwest. It's huge.
And with that, I will open the floor up. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask Mr. Keene? I guess they know everything, Mr. Keene. I mean, this.
No, they've already turned it off or fell asleep, or maybe both. Maybe both.
So I never asked questions anyway, either, because I felt I knew everything. I really, though, there were a few things that you said today that I didn't know and I don't remember reading, and I very much appreciate you sharing those from your own research, especially that the fact that Grainger was, I can't remember if you said invited to serve as the conductor of the St. Louis Symphony, or he won an audition to become the conductor of the St. Louis Symphony.
No, I don't know anything about an audition. I just know that he was offered the position, and they were also interested in, and who knows, in 1918, what the St. Louis Symphony was all about. And frankly, I don't even know if there was much of a St. Louis Symphony at that time. I just know that that's a fact, that he was offered that, and he turned it down because by that time he'd done some guest conducting, mostly of his own pieces, but also some other things. And of course, he'd done his solo work, so his name had gotten around in terms of symphonies. And it's just like, it's just like, when Schulte retired from the greatest orchestra in the world, the Chicago Symphony, and and immediately they offered it to one of the great pianists in the world. And so, I mean, that's kind of something that happened. But I can't answer your question. I don't know. But I know there was no audition because he was not really all that interested. The invitation just came out of the blue.
Any questions for Mr. Keene? Then I'm going to close with my standard question that I ask all of our guest Zoomers, and that is, can you tell us one, perhaps the craziest thing you've ever done in the name of band?
Yeah, I awarded a graduate assistantship to a guy named Dustin Seifert. No, I knew you were going to ask me that, so I was waiting for that question on that. Actually, I will have to say that I don't know any grad assistants we've ever had that worked any harder, was any more interested, any more gung ho, and developed and continued to grow than Dustin Seifert did. And I'll tell the students there, if any of them are still listening, I'm very proud of Mr. Seifert and the work he's doing. I was glad a few years ago I was able to see what you were doing on campus, and the respect that you had, the obvious respect that you had with your academic and musical colleagues, that you'd be department chair, as well as and balancing that and balancing the future and artistic division in the future of what's going on with the music department there. So I'm very proud of that.
Thank you.
To answer your question, and this is the answer I know you're looking for because you heard it for somebody else. This was back in the early 1980s. I think it was about 1981 or so. I was doing a rehearsal when I was still active with the marching band back in the 80s. And it was raining, and we had a very short time to put on a rehearsal. I was the band director at the University of Arizona, and it was raining. We had a short week to put on the show, and out there in the desert, there was no such thing as the ground absorbing water. It would be raining 5 minutes, and you'd have these huge puddles all over the place because the ground was so hard and everything was so hard. And the band was not getting the show learned because they were so worried about getting wet and stuff. So I was on the tower, and I came down, and I found the biggest puddle with the most mud. And I just rolled around. I called the band and asked them to get in a big circle. They didn't know what was going on. Around that, I got down in the mud, and I just rolled around. And then I got up, and I said, see, we're all going to get wet. Now let's get this show learned. And from that on, it was one of the greatest marching band rehearsals of anywhere of all time, because everybody just decided, hey, we'll go ahead and get wet too. So it didn't matter how wet it was. And people say, well, why'd you do a dumb thing like that? Well, because we had to get the job done. And you do whatever you do, if it means staying up all night to study the score, or do whatever you have to do to get the job done. And that's what we had to do to get the job done.
Amen.
So anyway, when I see Bruce Beach, I'm gonna scold him for telling you that story.
Yeah, I like that one. And I also remember a home game there at the U of I. I think it was Illinois Pork Producers Day, which was always my favorite home game because you could get bacon anything, at the stadium. And we were performing there with the MI on the steps of Memorial Stadium. And some trumpet player, it's always the trumpet players with the marching band. I don't know what the hell it is with them, but they blew the fermata and Oski and hung over your release point. And from that point to the end of Oski, which is a school spirit song, I remember that you extended your index finger and pointed at the kid till the end of the piece. I thought that was fantastic. Gosh, Mom and Dad were so proud of that kid. So with that, I will let you get on to your evening, Mr. Keene. Can we give him a round of applause, please?
Oh, it sounds like a thunderous ovation out there.
Well, you're getting a thunderous ovation. We thank you very much for your time and all of the wonderful information about Grainger that you shared with us. And we will see you all next time. Thank you.
Go practice,
folks. That's right.
Go practice. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.